Imagine walking down a narrow medieval street. The air is thick with the scent of smoke, roasted meat, and damp straw. You pass a shop marked not with a painted sign, but with a long wooden pole wrapped in red and white cloth, fluttering in the wind. At first glance, you might think it is simply the place to get your beard trimmed or your hair neatly cropped. But inside, beyond the chair where a man waits with lather on his chin, another patient sits trembling, his arm extended over a brass basin as dark blood flows freely from his veins. Welcome to the strange, unsettling world of the barber-surgeon, the man who would cut your hair, pull your teeth, stitch your wounds, and perhaps even saw off a limb, all within the same room. This dual life was not an eccentricity, but a necessity. In the Middle Ages, the practice of medicine was fractured. Learned physicians, often trained in universities and writing in Latin, preferred to diagnose from a distance, prescribing herbal remedies and dietary changes. They would not, however, dirty their hands with blood or blades. Monks, who once served as healers, were forbidden by the church from performing surgery, their vows of purity clashing with the gore of cutting flesh. Into this vacuum stepped the barbers, men already skilled with razors and sharp knives, accustomed to working with precision near the human body. From grooming to medicine, the leap was not as large as one might think. For the townspeople, the barber-surgeon was both savior and executioner. To have one's abscess lanced or rotten tooth yanked could mean the difference between agony and relief, between life and death. Yet each visit carried the weight of dread. The same hands that adjusted a bowl to catch falling curls could also adjust a basin to collect your blood. The same knife that trimmed hair might next peel back skin. There was no clear line between the comforting act of grooming and the terrifying act of surgery. It was a profession born in paradox, and one lived in paradox every day. The barber-surgeon's shop was a theater of both vanity and suffering. Wealthy patrons entered to maintain appearances, their beards carefully shaped, their hair smoothed. Beside them, peasants came seeking crude salvation from festering wounds or crippling ailments. The barber-surgeon stood between these worlds, serving beauty and necessity alike. His chair was both a salon and an operating table. Imagine the soundscape, the snip of scissors, the scraping of a razor against stubble, and then, from the next corner, the groan of a man enduring the hot iron pressed against a wound to cauterize it. The juxtaposition was brutal, and yet, for many centuries, this was normal life. Few questioned the strange union of barbering and surgery because the need was too great and the choices too few. The barber-surgeon embodied the raw resilience of medieval society. He was practical where scholars were theoretical, fearless where priests hesitated, and accessible where physicians demanded wealth. But his role also carried stigma. Some viewed him as little more than a butcher, a man meddling in mysteries of the body without divine sanction or scholarly knowledge. Others whispered that his trade skirted the boundaries of morality, for who else dared to hold so much power over another's body, balancing life and death in his bloodied hands? And yet, despite the danger, people returned again and again to his chair. For better or worse, the barber-surgeon was indispensable. He stitched soldiers on the battlefield, relieved townsfolk of aching teeth, and drained blood in the name of restoring balance. He was both barber and surgeon, healer and tormentor, artisan and butcher. His world was one of sharp blades, steady hands, and the unending cry of those who came to him in desperation. Thus begins the tale of one of the most difficult, misunderstood, and utterly fascinating professions of the medieval age. A profession that stood at the crossroads of grooming and medicine, of vanity and mortality. The barber-surgeon, half barber, half doctor, fully bound to the strange, brutal reality of medieval life. To understand how barbers became surgeons, we must step back into the chaotic swirl of medieval Europe, where medicine was as much superstition as science, and necessity often reshaped tradition. The barber-surgeon did not emerge suddenly. He was the product of centuries of shifting duties, restrictions, and desperate needs. His origins lie not in the ambition of medicine, but in the void left when others abandoned the blade. In antiquity, healing was entwined with philosophy and religion. Greek physicians like Hippocrates or Galen theorized about the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health, they claimed, depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Romans carried these ideas forward, but alongside physicians, there were always practical healers, men who cut, stitched, and treated wounds without lofty theories. After the fall of Rome, much of this structured medical learning collapsed, leaving monasteries to preserve fragments of ancient texts. For centuries, monks were the healers of Europe. Within monastic infirmaries, they grew medicinal herbs, copied medical manuscripts, and tended to both their brethren and local villagers. But a turning point came in 1163 at the Council of Tours. The Church declared, "Ecclesia abhorret a sanguine." The Church abhors blood. Monks were forbidden from shedding it, which meant they could no longer perform surgery. Suddenly, the responsibility for cutting into flesh, lancing boils, and setting bones fell elsewhere. Into this vacuum stepped the barbers. They were already trusted with sharp instruments, skilled in wielding razors close to skin without drawing blood, or, when necessary, in drawing just enough. Their daily work prepared them for delicate movements, steady hands, and patient interactions. What began as minor services, like pulling teeth or bloodletting, grew into more complex procedures, especially as soldiers returning from wars needed wounds treated and limbs amputated. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the barber's role had expanded so far beyond grooming that he was recognized as a separate professional identity, the barber-surgeon. He did not possess the scholarly knowledge of physicians trained in universities like Salerno or Montpellier. He did not speak Latin, nor did he debate medical theory. But he had experience, and experience was invaluable. Where physicians prescribed expensive tonics, the barber-surgeon acted with blade and bowl. Wars, too, accelerated his rise. As crusaders marched east and knights clashed across Europe, wounds demanded immediate, practical treatment. Battlefield surgery became the realm of barber-surgeons, men who traveled with armies, carrying their tools in leather satchels, improvising remedies in tents or under trees. They cut away shattered flesh, staunched bleeding, and sometimes even performed crude amputations to save lives. Though many patients perished, many others survived, owing their lives to the barber's unflinching courage. It was not only war, but urban life that sustained their profession. Medieval towns were crowded, filthy, and prone to outbreaks of disease. Physicians catered to the wealthy, but the poor and middling classes turned to barber-surgeons for affordable care. Whether it was a festering tooth, a swollen abscess, or the need for bloodletting to treat fevers, the barber-surgeon was the man available, the man willing. Thus, the profession grew in the cracks between high medicine and low necessity. It was born of exclusion, monks forbidden from cutting flesh, physicians too aloof to soil their hands, and of desperation. The barber-surgeon stepped forward where others would not. He became the surgeon of the people, both revered and reviled, indispensable yet marginalized. The barber's pole, with its red and white stripes, carries this history. The red represents blood, the white the bandages used to stop it, and the pole itself recalls the staff patients gripped while their veins were opened. It is not merely a sign of grooming, but a symbol of medicine's strange evolution, of how a barber's chair became, for centuries, the operating table of Europe. The origins of the barber-surgeon remind us that history is not made solely by kings and scholars, but also by those who stepped into necessity's shadow. His profession grew from the wounds of war, the silence of the church, and the neglect of physicians. It was a role forged in blood, steel, and the desperate will to survive. Step into the dim interior of a medieval barber-surgeon's shop, and you will find a world of paradoxical instruments, tools that could transform a man into a gentleman or reduce him to a patient on the edge of agony. On one table lies a neat set of combs, scissors, and razors gleaming in the candlelight. On another, darker corner sits a blood-stained basin, iron clamps, bone saws, and hooks. To the untrained eye, the line between grooming and surgery is blurred. For the barber-surgeon, it is all one trade, one craft, practiced with the same steady hand. The razor was his most faithful companion. Designed to scrape hair from the chin, it could just as easily cut into flesh. A skilled barber-surgeon might shave a nobleman in the morning and, in the afternoon, use the same razor, freshly cleaned if he was careful, to lance a boil or open a vein for bloodletting. Precision was everything. One slip while shaving drew blood. One miscalculation in surgery could draw death. Beside the razor, forceps and pliers held a place of grim importance. Teeth were often rotten in the Middle Ages, and aching molars drove peasants and lords alike to desperation. The barber-surgeon's tongs were crude but effective, designed to grip and yank in a single brutal motion. Screams echoed from shops as teeth cracked free and blood pooled on the floorboards. Yet the pain was short, and the relief, if infection did not follow, was often immediate. These forceps were symbols of both terror and salvation. Perhaps the most infamous of his tools was the lancet, a small, sharp blade used for bloodletting. Patients would sit gripping a staff, veins bulging, as the barber-surgeon opened them with a swift slice. A basin below would catch the flowing blood. This ritual, rooted in the ancient theory of balancing the body's humors, was not only common, but expected. The lancet, small and deceptively simple, was among the most powerful instruments of medieval medicine. It was feared, respected, and, at times, overused to the point of disaster. Then there were the bone saws. Heavy, crude, and terrifying, they were reserved for the direst of operations, amputations. After battles, when limbs were shattered beyond repair, barber-surgeons reached for these saws. Without anesthesia, the patient had only wine or strong arms to hold him down. The sound of the saw biting through bone was unforgettable, a noise that haunted both patient and practitioner. Yet, for many soldiers, this brutal procedure meant survival. Without amputation, infection would claim them. With it, they had a chance. The cautery iron was another tool of necessity. Heated until it glowed red, it was pressed against wounds to sear them closed. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, and the screams were unearthly. But it worked. Blood was staunched, infection sometimes prevented. The iron was the line between life and death, a tool both barbaric and effective. Not all instruments were horrific. Some were ingenious adaptations. Bandages of linen strips, soaked in wine or vinegar, served as primitive antiseptics. Herbal poultices were applied with wooden spatulas, mixing barber-surgeons' practical craft with folk remedies passed down for generations. In their toolkits, one could find a strange marriage of brutality and wisdom, science and superstition. The barber's pole itself was once a tool of the trade. Patients gripped it tightly during bloodletting, veins swelling as the barber-surgeon prepared his lancet. The pole's red and white stripes later became a symbol of the profession. a reminder that grooming and surgery once shared the same shop floor. What we now see outside barbershops as a cheerful sign was, in its origin, an emblem of blood and bandages. Looking at these tools, one might recoil at their crudity. And yet, within the limits of medieval knowledge, they were instruments of survival. The barber-surgeon's kit was not elegant, but it was practical, forged in necessity. With razor, lancet, forceps, and saw, he carved his place in history, not as a refined physician, but as a man who dealt directly, and often brutally, with the human body. His tools told the story of a world where medicine was raw, desperate, and unflinchingly real. Few practices define medieval medicine more starkly than the ritual of bloodletting. To the people of the Middle Ages, the body was a vessel governed by invisible forces. The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance, and imbalance meant illness. The solution, they believed, was simple: drain the excess. It was here that the barber-surgeon became a master of veins and basins, wielding his lancet with both confidence and dread. Imagine stepping into a barber-surgeon's shop not for a haircut, but because fever racks your body, your skin flushed and damp. You sit down on the same chair where another man had been shaved that morning. A staff is placed into your trembling hands, and a brass basin waits beneath your arm. With calm precision, the barber-surgeon ties a band around your bicep to raise the veins. He selects a small, sharp blade, dips it in wine to clean it, if he remembers, and then makes a swift incision. Dark blood streams down your arm, splashing into the basin. The hiss of relief from your lips mingles with the metallic scent of blood in the air. To the medieval mind, this was not grotesque. It was healing. The release of blood symbolized the release of illness, the rebalancing of the body. Physicians prescribed it, monks once practiced it, and barber-surgeons perfected it. People believed it could cure fevers, headaches, melancholy, even plague. Some came for bloodletting the way one might now go for a checkup, convinced it preserved health as much as it restored it. But bloodletting was not always gentle. Sometimes leeches were used, placed carefully on the skin to draw blood more slowly. In other cases, cups heated with flame were applied to the body, creating suction to pull blood to the surface before the lancet was applied. Each method had its champions. Each carried the same belief. Illness could be drained away, as if disease were a poison flowing in the veins. Yet the practice was riddled with risk. Too much blood lost, and the patient grew weak, even fatally so. Infections crept into open wounds. Children, the elderly, and those already frail sometimes never rose again from the barber's chair. But failure was rarely blamed on the barber-surgeon. Instead, it was seen as fate, or the will of God, or the stubborn imbalance of the humors. The procedure itself remained unquestioned, passed down through generations as both tradition and science. Bloodletting also carried a strange social ritual. The wealthy might schedule seasonal bleedings, almost as a form of luxury medicine, while the poor came only when desperation drove them. Knights before battle sometimes submitted themselves to the blade, believing that a balanced body would grant them strength in combat. Even kings were not exempt. Records tell of monarchs bled to treat fevers or melancholy, their lives entrusted to the steady hands of a barber-surgeon. The barber's pole, with its spiraling red and white stripes, stands as a relic of this practice. The red symbolized the blood, the white the bandages, and the pole itself the staff a patient would grip during the procedure. What seems to us a harmless symbol of haircuts was once the very mark of bloodletting. An advertisement that here, in this shop, life and health could be renewed by the draining of one's veins. For the barber-surgeon, bloodletting was more than a service. It was his gateway into legitimacy. Physicians might sneer, but when people felt relief, when fever subsided or headaches eased, gratitude turned into trust. He was no scholar, but he was practical, and practicality kept patients coming through his door. Looking back, bloodletting seems brutal, even absurd. But in a world without germ theory, without antibiotics, without true anesthesia, it was a ritual that made sense. It was simple, visible, and rooted in ancient authority. It offered hope when little else could. And so, basin after basin, cut after cut, the barber-surgeon kept draining the lifeblood of medieval Europe, sometimes saving lives, sometimes hastening death, but always embodying the fragile, desperate balance of medicine in the Middle Ages. Picture the marketplace of a bustling medieval town. Merchants shout prices for grain, children chase each other between stalls, and the smell of roasted meat mingles with the stench of refuse. In one corner, however, a different spectacle draws a crowd. A man sits on a wooden stool, gripping its edge with white knuckles. The barber-surgeon stands over him, forceps in hand, while bystanders press in, curious to witness the grim performance. A rotten tooth is about to be yanked, right there in the open air. This was the stage of the barber-surgeon. Not sterile chambers or marble halls, but the streets, taverns, and fairs of medieval Europe. Surgery was not confined to hospitals. Indeed, hospitals of the Middle Ages were often more like hospices for the poor and dying, not places of cure. Instead, treatment unfolded where life happened, at market squares, roadside tents, or in the very same chair where someone's beard had been shaved that morning. The street surgery was equal parts necessity and theater. When a toothache drove a man to madness, the barber-surgeon offered swift relief, and speed was his best weapon. With one wrenching pull, the tooth was gone, blood spurting as the crowd winced in sympathy. Sometimes the patient screamed, sometimes he fainted, but almost always the tooth came free, held aloft like a trophy for the crowd to see. For the barber-surgeon, it was not only medicine but advertisement, proof of his skill to anyone watching. Beyond dentistry, the barber-surgeon treated wounds where they occurred. A drunkard stabbed in a tavern brawl might be stitched on the tavern floor, his wound washed with ale before being sewn closed with thick thread. A farmer sliced by a scythe might be bandaged right there in the field. Soldiers, returning from battle with gaping wounds, were often tended on the roadside by barber-surgeons who followed the armies. The streets were their hospitals, and the world their waiting room. But these operations were never without risk. Without anesthesia, the only remedies for pain were strong drink, biting down on leather, or the iron grip of friends holding the patient still. Infection lurked in every corner. Dirty instruments, unwashed hands, and blood spattering onto soil or straw. The barber-surgeon's skill was judged not by sterility, but by swiftness, improvisation, and the sheer resilience of the human body to survive. Theatricality became part of the profession. Some barber-surgeons set up portable stages at fairs, displaying rows of extracted teeth or jars of blood to impress onlookers. They called out their services like entertainers, luring customers with promises of instant cures. It was a strange blend of medicine and performance, where the suffering of one became the reassurance of many that healing was possible. To the modern eye, this seems crude, even barbaric. Yet in the eyes of medieval townsfolk, it was both practical and miraculous. Where else could one find relief so quickly? Physicians were too expensive, monks forbidden to cut, apothecaries limited to herbs. The barber-surgeon stood in the gap, offering real, tangible results, even if they came with screams and scars. Street surgery also symbolized accessibility. The poor who could never afford a learned physician still had someone to turn to. In this way, the barber-surgeon was not only a craftsman, but also a servant of the common people. His shop might lack refinement, but it was open, public, and essential. In the end, the streets themselves bore witness to the realities of medieval medicine. The mingling of trade and treatment, spectacle and necessity, healing and harm. Surgery was not hidden away in academic halls, but lived openly amidst the chaos of daily life. The barber-surgeon's work was raw, unvarnished, and unashamedly visible. An unforgettable reminder that in the Middle Ages, survival often depended not on theory, but on the man with a blade standing in the middle of the street. Not all of the barber-surgeon's tasks could be performed quickly in the marketplace or with the spectacle of a tooth extraction. Some required greater nerve, steadier hands, and a stomach hardened against horror. These were the dangerous operations, the ones that pushed the limits of medieval medicine and tested both patient and practitioner in the rawest encounter with pain and survival. Foremost among them was amputation. War, farming accidents, and infections often left limbs shattered beyond repair. In such cases, the barber-surgeon faced a grim choice: remove the limb or watch the patient die. Without anesthetics, the procedure was merciless. The patient was held down by friends or assistants, given strong wine to dull the terror, and then the saw came down. First, the flesh was cut away with a razor-sharp knife. Then the bone was hacked through with a saw. The screams were unearthly, the smell unforgettable. If the patient survived the shock, the wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron, sealing it against further bleeding. Death from infection was common, but some lived, hobbling on crude wooden prosthetics, their lives owed to the brutal skill of the barber-surgeon. Another perilous procedure was the extraction of bladder stones, a torment that drove men to their knees in agony. Known as lithotomy, it involved cutting into the perineum to remove stones lodged in the bladder. Imagine the courage, or desperation, it took to submit to such an ordeal without anesthetics, with only a rough table and a crowd of onlookers. Many did not survive the bleeding or infection, yet for those who did, the relief was life-changing. To be freed of the pain of stones was worth the risk, and the barber-surgeon was the only one bold enough to attempt it. Head wounds, too, demanded intervention. Knights struck in battle or peasants injured by falling timber often suffered fractured skulls. The barber-surgeon's solution was trepanning, drilling or scraping a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or remove splinters of bone. With crude iron instruments, he opened the human head, sometimes saving a life, sometimes ending it in the attempt. To watch such a procedure must have been terrifying, but it was also awe-inspiring. The line between miracle and catastrophe was perilously thin. Abscesses and tumors provided another field of work. Swollen lumps of pus or hardened growths threatened both pain and death. The barber-surgeon lanced and drained them with practiced efficiency, but in deeper cases, he cut them out entirely. The risk of infection was immense, but so too was the danger of leaving them untreated. To the medieval patient, the barber-surgeon's knife was both curse and hope. Even hernias and fistulas fell under his blade. Though physicians might theorize about such conditions, it was the barber-surgeon who performed the actual cutting, sewing, and repairing. Crude stitches of linen thread or animal gut held wounds together, and if the patient survived, the scar was a badge of both suffering and survival. Each of these operations carried staggering danger. Without knowledge of bacteria, without antiseptics, every incision was a gamble. The barber-surgeon knew this, yet he acted anyway, because the alternative was certain death or endless agony. His courage, or perhaps his sheer necessity, was unmatched. Few professions demanded such unflinching confrontation with pain, blood, and mortality. And yet, these dangerous operations also elevated his reputation. For all the failures, for every patient lost, there were survivors who lived to tell the tale. To walk the streets on a wooden leg, to breathe freely after trepanning, to be free from the torment of stones. These were living testaments to the barber-surgeon's daring. People feared him, yes, but they also respected him, for no one else would take such risks. In the end, the dangerous operations defined the barber-surgeon as much as shaving or bloodletting. They were proof that his role was not trivial, not merely cosmetic, but essential to survival. He was a craftsman of both beauty and brutality, his hands shaping hair and flesh alike. In his world, the edge of the blade was the edge of life itself. To understand the barber-surgeon is to understand a man caught between worlds, the learned physicians with their Latin tomes, and the craftsmen who plied their trades with muscle and sweat. His training was not in lofty university halls, but in bustling workshops, noisy market stalls, and shadowed chambers where the smell of blood and hair mingled. It was an education of the hands, passed from master to apprentice, born not of theory but of necessity. Young apprentices began humbly, sweeping floors, boiling water, and sharpening razors. They watched their masters closely, memorizing the movements of the hand, the rhythm of a shave, the angle of a cut. Soon, they were allowed to shave customers, to practice the delicate art of steady hands and sharp blades. But their real lessons began when they watched their master tend to wounds or perform minor surgery. Each cut was a lesson, each patient's scream, a reminder of what was at stake. Unlike university-trained physicians, barber-surgeons had little access to Greek or Arabic medical texts, yet scraps of knowledge filtered down through translations, rumors, and practical guides. Simple manuals circulated, some filled with crude illustrations of instruments and procedures. These were not theoretical dissertations, but handbooks for men who needed quick answers. How to staunch bleeding, how to set a bone, how to lance a boil. They were the tools of survival, not philosophy. And yet, despite this humble training, barber-surgeons were not entirely ignorant of wider medical debates. Some were literate, able to read medical tracts, and a few even attended lectures or sought knowledge from traveling scholars. They absorbed fragments of Galen's humors, of Hippocrates' teachings, but always filtered through their own hard-earned experience. If a theory worked in practice, they kept it. If it failed, they abandoned it without regret. For them, truth was not found in books alone, but in the living, bleeding bodies of men and women. Guilds played a vital role in shaping their education. By the late Middle Ages, barber-surgeons organized into professional groups, part guild, part fraternity. These guilds regulated who could practice, how apprentices were trained, and what standards were expected. They created a sense of community, a brotherhood of men united by blades and blood. In some cities, the Guild of Barber-Surgeons became a powerful body, rivaling even the authority of physicians. They held ceremonies, examinations, and oaths, rituals that elevated their craft beyond mere trade into a recognized profession. Their tools, too, were teachers. The razor taught precision, the lancet taught speed, the saw taught endurance. Every nick, every scar, every accident left a mark not only on the patient, but on the apprentice himself. Experience was a harsh instructor, but it was also the most honest one. A failed operation could ruin reputations, even lives, but a successful one elevated the barber-surgeon to near legend. Of course, the lack of formal education drew scorn from physicians. Learned doctors sneered at the barber-surgeon's lowly training, dismissing him as little more than a butcher with a steady hand. But the barber-surgeon had something physicians lacked: the courage to act. While doctors prescribed herbs and prayers, the barber-surgeon cut, stitched, and cauterized. His education was forged in fire and flesh, his lessons written not in ink, but in blood. And in the eyes of the people, that was what mattered most. Villagers did not care whether their healer could quote Galen in Latin. They cared whether he could stop the bleeding, pull the tooth, or saw off the limb before infection claimed it. For them, the barber-surgeon's training was more valuable than all the lofty learning of universities. His knowledge was practical, immediate, and paid for in survival. Thus, the barber-surgeon's training was neither glamorous nor scholarly, but it was real. It was the training of men who could not afford mistakes, who learned by doing and lived by daring. In a world where life and death were so precariously balanced, their knowledge, hard-won, imperfect, but vital, was nothing less than a lifeline. To see the barber-surgeon at work was to witness both admiration and unease. He was a familiar figure in towns and villages, his striped pole standing like a beacon at the corner of the street, signaling to passers-by that within lay not only a place for grooming but also for healing. Yet his presence carried with it a certain shadow, for he dealt with the body in ways that made others uncomfortable. He cut, bled, and stitched, hovering dangerously close to the mysteries of life and death. In the eyes of the common folk, the barber-surgeon was indispensable. He was the one who pulled the aching tooth when the pain grew unbearable, who set the broken bone after a fall from a cart, who lanced the festering boil before it poisoned the blood. His shop was a place of relief, where men emerged clean-shaven and women whispered in gratitude for wounds healed or ailments soothed. In a world where access to physicians was rare and costly, the barber-surgeon was the healer of the people. But his standing in society was complicated. To the elite, he was a man of the lower orders, a craftsman whose work dirtied his hands and whose knowledge came from experience rather than scholarly study. He was not invited into the chambers of nobility, except when necessity forced it, when a lord required bloodletting or an abscess needed draining. Even then, the barber-surgeon entered quietly, performed his task, and left without fanfare. For all his usefulness, he remained on the margins of respectability. Yet in the bustling marketplaces and taverns, his name carried weight. People spoke of his skill, his courage, and sometimes his failures. A botched operation could make him a figure of ridicule, but a successful one could elevate him to near legendary status. Stories spread quickly. The barber-surgeon who saved a soldier from death after a spear wound, the one who pulled 3 rotten teeth in a single sitting, the one who stitched a man's face so neatly that the scar became a badge of honor. These tales built his reputation far more than any diploma or guild charter. Religion, too, played a role in shaping how society viewed him. The church had long frowned upon bloodshed, declaring that the shedding of blood was unworthy of priests and monks. This opened the door for barber-surgeons to take on tasks the clergy abandoned. They became, in a sense, the hands that did what holy men would not. Some saw them as necessary servants of God's will, providing practical care where prayer alone could not suffice. Others muttered that their work was unclean, even sinful, too closely tied to the body's frailty and corruption. Despite these tensions, barber-surgeons found ways to integrate into community life. Their shops became social spaces where men gathered not only for a shave, but for conversation, gossip, and news. A barber's chair was a confessional of sorts, where secrets were spilled along with hair and blood. This dual role, healer and confidant, gave the barber-surgeon a unique place in the fabric of society. He was both artisan and listener, a man who knew the town's pulse in more ways than one. Festivals and fairs often provided opportunities for barber-surgeons to showcase their skills. Traveling surgeons set up stalls, performing extractions or minor operations in front of gawking crowds. These public displays were part medicine, part theater, where the courage of the patient and the steady hand of the surgeon were both put on show. Though risky, such performances helped build reputations and attract new patrons, reminding society that healing could be as much spectacle as salvation. In this way, the barber surgeon occupied a strange but vital niche. He was neither fully respected nor entirely scorned, neither wholly trusted nor wholly dismissed. Society relied on him, feared him, and gossiped about him in equal measure. He was a man at the crossroads of utility and suspicion, forever walking the fine line between necessity and taboo. And yet, without him, countless lives would have ended sooner. Countless pains remained unrelieved. The world of the barber surgeon, once so central to daily life, did not remain unchanged. As Europe shifted through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the balance of knowledge, power, and respect began to tilt. The barber surgeon, who had once stitched wounds beneath the gaze of villagers and kings alike, found himself gradually edged out of the role he had carved with blood and sweat. It began with the rise of universities and the slow but steady establishment of medicine as a scholarly profession. Learned physicians, trained in anatomy, Latin texts, and the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, began to assert their dominance. They wrote treatises, lectured in grand halls, and presented themselves as men of science. Though their hands rarely touched a blade, they claimed the authority to define the boundaries of healing. Against this tide of scholarship, the barber surgeon's earthy practical methods seemed coarse, even primitive. Guilds and professional hierarchies reinforced the division. Surgeons, seeking to elevate themselves above the barbers, formed their own societies, demanding training, apprenticeships, and examinations. In France, the Parisian College of Surgeons drew a line between the surgeons of the long robe, who studied formally, and the surgeons of the short robe, who worked with their hands. The barber surgeon, with his mix of razors and lancets, found himself relegated to the latter, placed firmly on the lower rung of the ladder. The invention of the printing press accelerated this decline. Medical knowledge, once passed orally or through apprenticeship, now spread rapidly through books. Physicians and academic surgeons shared discoveries about circulation, anatomy, and disease. With each new publication, the barber surgeon's lack of formal training became more glaring. He could not cite authorities, nor produce diagrams of the body's inner mysteries. His wisdom came from the street, the battlefield, the barber's chair. Real but unwritten, respected by the common man but dismissed by scholars. Even so, barber surgeons continued to adapt. Some embraced the growing emphasis on training, sending apprentices not only to sweep floors and sharpen razors, but also to watch dissections and learn basic anatomy. Others leaned into their traditional role, focusing on grooming and minor procedures, leaving major surgeries to the rising class of educated surgeons. In many towns, the barber's shop remained a hybrid space. Its pole still spiraled in red and white, but its role quietly shifting from battlefield wounds to beards and hair. The wars of the Renaissance and early modern period provided another chance for transformation. On the battlefield, where physicians rarely trod, barber surgeons still proved indispensable. They followed armies across Europe, tending to gunshot wounds, amputating shattered limbs, and keeping soldiers alive in brutal conditions. It was in this crucible that some barber surgeons, like Ambroise Paré, rose to fame, showing that experience could rival book learning. Paré, once a barber surgeon's apprentice, became one of the most celebrated surgeons of his age, proving that the line between barber and surgeon was not entirely impermeable. Yet even as individuals rose, the profession as a whole lost ground. By the 17th century, barber-surgeons were increasingly confined to the humble tasks of grooming, bloodletting, and minor care. Their once vital role as healers was diminished, overshadowed by the triumph of academic medicine and professional surgery. The barber-surgeon, once a figure both feared and relied upon, faded into the background of European life. And yet, he did not disappear entirely. The barber's pole, with its red and white stripes, became a lasting symbol of this strange marriage between grooming and healing. In every swirl of paint lay a memory of blood and bandages, razors and scalpels, of men who had once straddled two worlds, the world of beauty and the world of pain. The decline of the barber-surgeon was not so much an ending as a transformation, a reshaping of his role to suit the new age of science. In the end, history did not erase him. It merely folded him into the story of progress, a reminder of the days when surgery was performed on street corners and healing was as raw and public as the blood that stained the cobblestones. History has a curious way of polishing what was once crude. When we think of the barber-surgeon now, it is easy to imagine only the blood, the screaming patients, the rough tools gleaming in the light of a marketplace. Yet beneath that raw exterior lay something more enduring, a legacy that stretches far beyond the cobblestones of medieval towns, reaching into the very heart of modern medicine. The barber-surgeon's greatest gift was accessibility. He brought healing to the streets, to the fields, to the homes of the poor and forgotten. For centuries, physicians cloistered in universities or courts were beyond the reach of common folk. But the barber-surgeon was there, day after day, ready with blade and bandage. In this way, he democratized care, ensuring that medicine was not reserved for kings alone, but for shepherds, bakers, and beggars. His legacy survives in the principle that health must be available to all, not just the privileged few. Another lasting contribution was practical skill. The barber-surgeon lived and worked in the physical realities of the body, not in the pages of theory. He knew the weight of an arm freshly severed, the heat of fever on a brow, the way blood poured from a wound when pressure was released. His knowledge was tactile, immediate, rooted in experience. Modern medicine, though steeped in science, still relies on this legacy. The hand that steadies in surgery, the eye that judges the wound, the intuition honed by repetition. The barber's pole itself remains an unmistakable symbol. The swirling red and white stripes, sometimes with a touch of blue, remind us of the dual heritage of grooming and healing. Red for blood, white for bandages, blue for veins. Together they tell the story of men who shaved faces and saved lives in the same breath. Even today, outside barbershops around the world, that pole silently spins, a relic of a time when barbers held not just razors, but also the fate of their patients in their hands. Their legacy also lives in the evolution of surgery itself. Figures like Ambroise Paré, who began as a barber-surgeon, reshaped the field with innovation and compassion, replacing boiling oil with gentle bandages, inventing new surgical tools, and proving that humanity could temper brutality. Through men like him, the profession left behind the shadows of the marketplace and stepped into the halls of science, carrying with it the courage and pragmatism that had always defined its practice. Yet perhaps the most human legacy of the barber-surgeon is the reminder that healing is rarely clean. It is messy, painful, and fraught with risk. The barber-surgeons confronted this truth daily. They faced screams, failures, and deaths, yet they continued because people needed them. Their story is not just one of crude tools and bloodstains. It is one of perseverance in the face of imperfection. They remind us that medicine has always been, and will always be, a struggle between knowledge and uncertainty, compassion, and fear. In art and literature, they endure as vivid characters. Part healer, part showman, part craftsman, part outcast. They embody the strange liminal space between science and superstition, between necessity and taboo. Their story fascinates us precisely because it is uncomfortable, forcing us to confront how fragile human life once was and how much courage it took to save it with so little to hand. So, as we look back on the barber-surgeon, we see not a figure of ridicule but a testament to human adaptability. They filled the gaps when no one else would. They stitched, cut, bled, and soothed, standing at the crossroads of two worlds, the world of the razor and the world of the scalpel. And though their profession faded into history, their spirit lives on in every surgeon who steadies their hand, in every healer who works among the poor, and in every spinning barber's pole that whispers of a time when barbers and surgeons were one. The barber-surgeon is gone, but his shadow lingers, a reminder that even the humblest trades can leave a mark on history, written not in ink, but in blood, bandages, and survival.